what is this Project 2030? Well, Project 2030 is a global initiative that is being carried out by the African Holocaust Memorial World Assembly. And what is, it is a global recognition of the African Holocaust in a reckoning with black history, so that black history is brought out as a great light to shine throughout the world, so that people become aware of the history. Let me try to create a context to understand. I want you to imagine with me just for a minute that someone comes along and they gain your trust, and then they start subtly talking to you and saying, hey, look, your hair doesn't look very nice. You need to do something to fix your hair. And then they come along and say, look, you don't seem to be very smart. And then they start subtly telling you you're ugly, you're stupid, you you stink, you are offensive to other people, your family members hate you, they all despise you, and they're plotting against you behind your back. And so this person comes along and they work diligently to undermine your self-confidence. They work diligently to destroy your self-concept, your self-image. And they do this because they want to destabilize you mentally. And they want to do this because they want to take possession and control of something that they covet, that you have, that they want, that you have, and they want it. So they have figured out a scheme on how to get it and take it from you. And so they engage in all types of delusion and deception and fraud and misinformation. And then they lie and cheat and steal and murder and do everything that they can in order to take what you have and to take away your dignity, to take away your personhood. And if we go back and study the history, we'll find that this is precisely what happened to black people. And that when we go back and begin to examine the history, this becomes very apparent to us. And so 2030 is a year of reckoning. It is a year where the facts come out and we become conscious of this. And it's a progressive progress. It's in progress right now. And many people are already aware. But this 2030 will be the year that we declare it openly. And that not only do we declare it openly, but we, in 2030, we will celebrate our ancestors worldwide, and we will recognize what happened and acknowledge it publicly so that it never, ever, ever happens again. So let's take a look at this and go back historically. First of all, when we go back in history, you can take a look, for example, of the Nile River. And the Nile River is about just short of 4,300 miles long. It is the longest river in the world. It is longer than the Amazon. And if we look at where its headwaters start and how it starts below Lake Victoria and then it empties into the Mediterranean. It has a number of tributaries along the way, and it also drains certain areas. For example, the the snow-capped mountains, the so-called Mount of the Moon region, and we can look at this whole region in this area in a historical context, and we can look at it and we can compare it to the Tigris, Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. We can look at it and compare it to the Yellow River in China. We can compare it to the Ganges and other important rivers in India. We can compare it to the Amazon itself. We can actually even look at the Yucatan Peninsula and examine the Mississippi. And when we look at this river, the Nile, and compare it to all of the other rivers, important major tributaries of rivers on the earth, what we discover is something very unique about the Nile. And that is that not only is modern man, Homo sapien sapien, man with the cranial capacity of modern man, was born along the Nile. And we can see evidence of his skeletal remains in robust numbers. And it becomes very clear that not only was modern man born on the African continent, but every previous stage of man originated on the African continent and then began spreading out and radiating out around the globe. And some with very limited range, like Homo erectus and Homo habilis, and some of the earlier stages of man before reaching modern man, man with the cranial capacity of modern man. And we see man spread out into some areas of the world in its primitive state. But modern man, when we begin to examine modern man remains on the African continent for nearly 300,000 years before he begins to branch out and spread out around the globe. And what we find is that he enters into the Levant region. This region, the so-called area of Palestine, was called the Valiat of Syria. It was known prior to World War I. When we began to look at this, what we discover is that about 100,000 years ago, man began migrating out of Africa, and he actually travels this land bridge from ancient Egypt in North Africa. He travels across and enters into this region about 100,000 years ago. Now we see some anomalous movements prior to that, but not much further back. But we see groupings of people, and we see settlements of people, and we see the evidence that man is truly migrating, and not just an anomalous investigator or anomalous traveler who's by themselves or lost or whatever, but we see evidence that man is migrating out of the African continent. And we see this in the Levant going back about 100,000 years ago. And then we see that man, similar to reaching the Levant, begins to reach the southern part of Asia between 65 and 70,000 years ago. And then we also see him reaching places like Australia between 65 and 55,000 years ago. We also see that man reaches Europe about 40,000 years ago. And then we also see modern man reaching Siberia about 25,000 years ago, and then ultimately crosses the Bering Strait and enters into the Americas about 16,000 years ago. Now, there are varying debates surrounding these dates, but they are the variations in date are really insignificant because we're talking long periods of times, and these are ranges. But the bottom line becomes that we see along the Nile, not only has man began to develop and began to achieve very significant things in learning along the Nile, but man then spreads out around the world, and we do not see any evidence in any of these other places, whether it is Mesopotamia, in the Tigris Euphrates River Valley. We don't see any evidence of man's activities similar to we find along the Nile, in the Yellow River, in the Ganges, in the Mississippi, in the Amazon. When we go around the world, there is absolutely no comparison when we look at the Nile. And so in terms of, it becomes very clear, not only by the skeletal remains found, but now through DNA mitochondria studies, the Dr. Rebecca Kahn discovered the black woman was the mother of humanity, the so-called mitochondrial DNA, the mitochondrial Eve, showing the travel and origin of people as they spread out across the globe. In addition to that, we also find it in other early texts like the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And it said, we come from the beginning of the Nile at the foot of the Mount of the Moon. And researchers like Mary Lewis and Richard Leakey, a British anthropologist and archaeological team, actually began to dig in the Aduvio or Duvii Gorge as a result of finding these scriptures and being able to decipher these scriptures. It led them to the digs where they discovered the bones of Zinjanthropus bassi, whom they called Lucy, and whom Africans called Mambujige, the mother of humanity. And so when we began to look at this evidence and put all this evidence together, we not only see that man originated on the African continent and then spread out and radiated out around the globe, but we find that Africans did not leave the continent until about 100,000 years ago. And so we can look and we can see, for example, they found a site in the Sudan, which at one point would have been called Nubia, but it's called Afad 23, and it goes back 70,000 years ago. So, excuse me, there's a 70,000-year-old site that showed where black people on the African continent were constructing houses. Not only were they constructing houses, but they also had workshops where they were creating stone tools. In addition to that, there's the evidence that shows that they were engaged in agriculture. And it also, there's evidence that they were domesticating cattle. And so when we began to look at the evidence and put the evidence together, what we see is the development of human civilization with no parallel comparison 70,000 years ago on the African continent. Now you may hear about Göbekli Tepe in the Anatolia region of Turkey, but it goes back about 11,000 years, and Kurihan Tepe goes back about 9,000 years. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in India goes back about 5,000 years. So when we began to look at the evidence around the globe, there's no comparable evidence when we began to look at Afad 23 in Sudan. Not only that, there are multiple other sites discovered in this region that have not been fully examined, which clearly shows that not only was man born in Africa, but man was developing the foundational elements of civilization and society very, very early, before exiting the African continent. And so we can also begin to look at some of the other types of evidence that have emerged in terms of, for example, from about 25,000 years ago in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that is called that today, that region, they discovered something called the Ishango bone. And this Ishango bone was discovered, and it actually contains a mathematical system and a method of calculating and counting that showed a very clear understanding of advanced and important mathematical principles that would have been learned over a substantial period of time. In addition to that, there also was discovered about 40,000 year old in southern Africa, something called the Lumbumbo bone. And both of these bones are the fibula of a baboon, which is the choice of the bone. It's a dense bone that would last and that would, survive over time. So it's very clear that these people had an intent behind the selection of the medium that they were writing on and communicating with. And these were very important artifacts that were clearly passed down generation after generation. So it's a way to preserve knowledge and information. And when we began to look at the Lumbumbo bone, what we discover is that it actually is recording the cycle of the moon in 29.5 cycle count in terms of every 29.5 days. This moon cycle repeats. And we later see this in later cultures, and they talk about the new moon and stuff like that. But all of that is much later copied from what this foundation was built by black people. In addition, we can begin to look at some other major elements within the African culture and African society. We can see that the civilization and high culture of ancient Egypt actually began in the south, in the region that would be now called Sudan, the Nubian region, and that this was the beginning of the ancient Egyptian high culture. And this was the achievement of black people from sub-Saharan black Africa. And they began to populate this region and build this region up. And we can see by looking at, for example, the burial grounds at Abydos, we can see so many other elements of the high culture being from the south. And Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, who was a physicist, he was an anthropologist, he was a mathematician, he was distinguished as a linguist, he was distinguished at the PhD level in about 5 different disciplines. And he wrote a book called The African Origin of Civilizations. And one of the things that he pointed out was that the ancient Egyptian language was an indigenous black African language, and that all the early kings from pre-dynastic times up until the 14th dynasty were indigenous black Africans from the south. And then there were later intermediate type of dynasties that came along, like the 25th dynasty and some others that were indigenous black Africans from the south. But during this period of pre-dynastic times up to the 14th dynasty, Egypt is an indigenous black ruled place. And so, but what is most significant about it is that when we examine it, what we discover is that this is the period of time where 79 pyramids were built. This is the period of time when the mathematical sciences were well developed. This is the period of time where they discovered a pharmacological manual with about 750 plants in their medicinal usage. They also discovered studies of the pulse and circulation, of the treatment of abscesses and burns, and studies in gynecology. So their medical technology was off the charts at that time. And the Greeks later worshipped Imhotep as their god of medicine under the Greek name Asclepius. And so when we go back and look, we can examine this early period of time and we can see that this high culture of ancient Egypt, this is when 5 planets were charted. This is the period of time where the great year was well understood and documented. That this 26,000 year cycle of the precession of the equinoxes. And this is something that had been measured and studied. And we can examine this and see that you can go back to the Shango bone and the Lumbombo bone. You can go back to, looking at all of these things that took place. And even the black culture in the Czech Republic, this culture of black people who settled in the Czech Republic, who also established and documented a mathematical system on a wolf bone. And the evidence has demonstrated these were black people. And so that were some of the first occupants of Europe, and that the YT Europeans didn't even appear to between 10 and 8,000 years ago. And so in terms of when we began to examine the evidence and began to examine the facts on the ground and look at the robust amount of evidence that exists, what we see is this early high culture of ancient Egypt was an indigenous black African achievement. And then, of course, it became somewhat cosmopolitan. It invited others, and people came from the Levant and from Mesopotamia, and people came from all over. And ultimately, you had waves of invaders come into ancient Egypt. You had the Hyksos, you had the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Turks, and many others. The British, the French, all came to invade and take control and possession of ancient Egypt, because ancient Egypt was the prize. It was the foundation for everything. It was the origin of human knowledge and consciousness. It was where all the secrets were. And so everyone wanted to control this. Everyone wanted possession of it, all of the different groups of people around the world. So we can look at this and put this all in context. And one of the things that becomes, I think, very critical in understanding is that this success of black people, this success of black civilization, became the envy of all other peoples of the world. And other people wanted to possess. They wanted to have control. They wanted to be the one in charge, so to speak, right? So let's look at just a couple things. I'm going to delve a little deeper into this, and then I want to bring some observations I think that are critical. First of all, let's look at, for example, the Khufu Pyramid. The Khufu Pyramid was built about 2560 BC, and we have a more precise understanding of when it was built, not only from the mathematics of its structure, but we also know because of the robust records kept that were involved in its construction. We can understand it in a historical context. And so we also have the line of kings, and we see what dynasty it was in, and we have detailed information. The Khufu Pyramid reached 481 feet in height. It was the largest, and not only the largest pyramid, but its internal construction was made of geopolymer concrete and granite. And so this was something that was engineered. The Khufu pyramid was an engineered structure that involved highly sophisticated mathematical calculations. It was a demonstration of a level of science that there's no comparable demonstrations around the world. And so let's take a look at it. Let's examine that. There was the so-called Great Pyramid of Supe, the what they call Corral Supe, found in Peru. Its height was 28 meters, and which is about 92 feet high, compared to 481 feet high. So this is the largest, most significant pyramid in the Americas, and it's the oldest. This Corral Supe, located in Peru, and it's 92 feet high compared to 481 feet of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Khufu Pyramid. Its engineering of Corral Supe is not even comparable, and it is actually a facade built on top of a constructed mound using sacks of dirt, in essence. So when we began to look at the engineering, and we see something that's actually created as a platform, and even in terms of its religious and its historical and scientific, it just simply is not comparable. And so in terms of when we look at this, we see this high culture of ancient Egypt, and then we see this great achievement in Peru, the Corral Supe, the Great Pyramid of Supe. And it's not even comparable. You take a look at the Great Pyramid of Levanta, and this is the Olmec Pyramid, the Great Olmec Pyramid. It was built between 900 and 600 BC. And it actually is an earthen clay mound with a facade over it, and it's a platform type structure. It reached a height of 100 feet compared to 481 feet for the Khufu Pyramid. And so when you began to look at and compare structures around the world, it just simply no comparison. You look at even the so-called mound builders in the Americas, but you see mounds in Japan, and you see mounds across Asia, and you see mounds in Europe, and mounds in Africa. And these mounds, these burial type mounds, what you see in the Americas are primitive by comparison in many instances. But what happens is people use this as they use disinformation to trick you into believing things that aren't true about the mounds in America, and make you want to identify with the mounds in America as though this was some great achievement. And what it is, it's like tricking you and playing off of your lack of knowledge. So let's look at this and compare. Even if we look at, say, the Ziggurats, the Chigoa Zanbil Ziggurat in Kyrgyzstan, it's about 82 feet high, 25 meters high. You look at the Great Ziggurat of it's about 60 feet high, or 18 meters high, built in 2100. So you begin to look at this and do this comparison, say, to the Great Pyramid. And you could actually compare it to multiple other ancient Egyptian pyramids. And it's just from an engineering standpoint, from a knowledge standpoint, in terms of the construction of what is involved, the mathematical principles, etc., there's just simply no real comparison. And so these things are really primitive in comparison to the achievement of this black high culture that developed from pre-dynastic times until the 14th dynasty. And so when we began to examine this, what we discover is that later a whole science developed called Egyptology. And this was an effort to try to debunk the African origins of this high culture of ancient Egypt. And it's something that has failed miserably. It was an attempt to defame black people. It was an attempt to cover over and hide the great achievements that black people made. And so I want to point out something that there was a French historian named Count C.F. Volney, and he published a book in 1793. And this book was known as Ruins of Empires. And in this book, after having visited the Nile Valley and traveled around the world and examined and compared ruins of ancient civilizations, and Count C.F. Volney wrote this book, Ruins of Empires, and in it he says, "Those piles of ruins which you see in that narrow river or that narrow valley watered by the Nile are the remains of opulent cities, the pride of the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia." And notice he says Ethiopia. "Behold the wrecks of her metropolises, of Thebes with her 100 palaces, the parent of cities, and the monument of the caprice of destiny. There a people, now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences, a race of men now rejected from society for their black skin and woolly hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe." And this was written by Count C.F. Volney in his book, Ruins of Empires. And it made Europeans go wild. The academic community just went off its rocker to try to debunk this observation by independent scholar Count C.F. Volney. Count C.F. Volney, he wasn't pushing an agenda of white supremacy. He wasn't pushing an agenda of black supremacy. He wasn't pushing any type of agenda other than his observation and reporting truthfully what he discovered. And as a result of his truthful reporting and discovery, there was organized the School of Egyptology. And what they did was they came along and they came up with a new invention. And they said that, well, as everyone knows, that Noah, the ark, landed on Mount Ararat in the Caucasus Mountains. And so technically everybody on earth is a Caucasian. And so they made the assumption that everyone was a YT person, and that then there was a curse by Noah that was a curse on Canaan, his grandson, the son of Ham, his son, Noah's son. And this became a mythology to indicate this was the origin of the black race, that black people did not exist until this curse by Noah on his grandson Ham as punishment for misconduct of Ham, his son. And a whole mythology developed around this, but they used this as a basis to say that everyone was a Caucasian. And so they came back with an argument to say that these people that live in this Nile Valley, these people identified by Count C.F. Volney, who actually looked at mummies. He saw the afro combs in the tombs. He saw the afro hairdos. He saw the imagery and art that they made and left of pictures of themselves. And he's all of these things that Count C.F. Volney saw directly. To try to debunk that, what they did was they came back and said, well, these people are not Negroes. they're dark-skinned Caucasians. And then after a few years, instead of saying they're dark-skinned Caucasians, they just said they're Caucasians. And so this mythology began to develop within the European community that somehow these were people, these were YT people, and that this ancient Egypt was a YT achievement, when in fact it was an indigenous black African achievement in high culture. And you could go back into the history and study the continuity of history all leading up to that time and track its origins back into the African continent, not into Europe, not into Mesopotamia or Asia or any other place, but into Africa. And so what they did was they spun an elaborate lie, a disinformation campaign designed to denigrate black people, to justify the atrocities they were committing against black people. And when we go back and examine it, for example, we hear about the story of Noah. Christian, Islamic, and Jewish scholars generally agree that Noah would have existed between about 2200 and about 2500 BC. But when we go back and examine, we see that in ancient Egypt has a continuing history in robust evidence that very clearly there was no global deluge. All the Egyptians were not wiped out by some flood, and that there's a continuous history that goes there. And so the question becomes, do we look at and believe and understand the actual physical evidence on the ground showing the continuation and existence of this culture and this group of people? And actually, there are multiple other peoples around the world, very similar situation in terms of the evidence that there's no global deluge. So the only place we find that is in the Torah, a supposedly a scripture text that the second century historian and scholar Tertullian says that the Torah is allegorical and not historical. So in other words, he's saying, hey, look, this is not history. This is an allegory. This is a word story that's, it's like to try to teach you something, whatever, but it's not actual history, so you can't take it for actual history. But people have mistakenly taken it for history, and they promoted it and used it as if it were actual history when it's not, in fact, history. And so we began to look at this, and we see that there's no evidence of a global deluge that supports the ideal that there was a global flood of Noah. And then we can see, like, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh has a flood story. And we can begin to trace back the origin and see even the origin of the story as it appears in the biblical text. So, when we began to really closely examine the history and understand this history, what we can see and understand, I think, is brought out by several, I think, very significant scholars of our time. One, of course, is Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, and what Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, he shows by multiple forms of evidence. He shows that the ancient Egyptian high culture was an indigenous black African high culture. He also shows, along with Theophile Obengo, they did linguistic studies, and they were able to show the affinity between indigenous black African Bantu languages and the languages of Europe and Asia and other places, to show that the ancient Egyptian language was an indigenous black African language. And it showed the connection between this high culture and the peoples of sub-Saharan black Africa. In addition to that, there's also cataloged, for example, you have the Dogon people in West Africa, and the Dogon people actually document and talk about that they came from Nile Valley, from this southern part of the Nile region, the Nubian area. In addition to that, the Yoruba people have a very similar story of their trek and their travel and their origin in this particular region. In addition to that, you have the Takor people in Cameroon have very similar tradition. And you find this tradition all over the African of sub-Saharan Black Africa of indicating and showing these migrations from this Nile Valley. As the Nile Valley was attacked and conquered and destroyed, the black people fled to other regions of the African continent. And they established new cultures and new communities and new civilizations. And the reality of the history, it's such a distinctive and clear record that when we look at, for example, the linguistic evidence, and then not only that, we see major other artifacts that support this same theory. And not only that, now it's also being reinforced by DNA evidence. And so when we began to examine this and understand this, it's important to make this distinction and recognize, for example, North Africa. In North Africa, the people of North Africa speak Afro-Asiatic languages. Or they're a mixture with Asia, and other groups of invaders that conquered North Africa. But sub-Saharan Black Africa, the Africans separated by the Sahara Desert in the south, that they speak Bantu, Nilotic languages. They speak Niger-Congo languages, part of the Bantu family of languages. And they have a distinctive speech that is different from North Africa. And when you began to look at and examine this actual history, what you'll find is a very distinct history of black people in the Nile Valley and in sub-Saharan Black Africa. And you see this connection, this affinity between them. And even Black America today, if you look throughout the Americas, Black Americans, about 95% of Black America's African ancestors, including black people in the United States and North America and Central America, in the Caribbean and South America, throughout the Americas, ancestry traces back to sub-Saharan Black Africa. Very rarely do you find blacks with any North African DNA. And when you do, it's a very, very small quantity. And so the fact of the matter is that on average, about 74% of Black Americans' DNA traces back to sub-Saharan Black Africa. And so when we began to examine what this really means historically, it means that black people in America have a direct connection to the Bantu-speaking peoples of sub-Saharan Black Africa and connect directly back to the ancient Egyptian high culture that produced the high culture of ancient Egypt, that produced the science that has basically been the foundation of the development of human civilization. And so this connection, this connectivity is extremely important. And so when you have people that are telling you that, well, you're stupid, you're ugly, you stink, you're dumb, you're this, you're that, and negative things to try to impose some type of negative thing upon you to make you self-hate. When you actually begin to know and understand the facts and you stand in the light of the sun, the brightness of your presence is blinding to those people that are ignorant, those people that are living in a delusion, that whose house is built, on sand, and who have no real foundation. When you begin to take a look at this and understand this history, and you can share this history and talk about it, and you can defend it, you'll see a changing world. You'll see everything change, because when you begin to really examine all of this and closely take a look at it, it just, it changes things, and you look at this region, the so-called Dongola region of below Egypt. And this Dongola region, and this is the area where 523 is located, is found. They also found something there. You had the African Christian kingdoms of Makoria, Nobatia, and Aloha. And you began to look at this region and you see the robust development of this region, and you see their architecture, and you see their advancement. And then you see later come along writings from people like Ibn al-Khaldun and al-Omari and Idrisi and al-Bukhari and al-Masudi and Ibn Battuta and so many other Arab writers. We see them come along and they write. And one of the things that Professor Sheikh Anta Diop does is he looks on the ground at the evidence and compares it to their writings. And he points out that there's discrepancies between what is found on the ground and what their writings say. So he points out, for example, stories about some great Arab architect being brought in, and he helped them build these mosques in West Africa and all these kinds of things. But the actual structures are just replicas of Sudanic, Nubian architecture that had existed long, long before there was even Islam, before the Arab culture developed. And so in terms of, I think it's significant to point these things out and to understand that when we look at, for example, even the so-called golden age of Islam, what we discover is that it's all based upon the theft of the achievements of black people and taking them and upstaging it and taking credit for these things and pretending that they did it. And this is just part of the historical reality. So when we go back and look at the algebra and look at the counting system, these 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it was actually found in the first step pyramid of Saqqara, long before the existence of an Arabian culture. And so in terms of when we go back and look at this and examine the facts on the ground, what we discover is that black people have achieved some very, very great things. And not only have black people achieved some very great things, but when you go back and you think of, say, the religion of Christianity or Islam or whatever, or Judaism, there is a book written by Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan. And Dr. Ben is a profound scholar, spoke 13 different languages, and people argue about his identity, but he claimed and documented that he was born as so-called Falasha from Ethiopia. And many try to discredit him or whatever. But the reality of it is that when you look at his work, he published something called The African Origins of the Major Western Religions. And he points out the fact that when we look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they actually copied from the early and ancient Egyptian religious structures and systems that were in place. And so when you go back and you take a look at it, you see things like the story of Joseph, and then you see the tale of two brothers, and you see the Moses part the waters of the Red Sea, but you see 2,500 years prior, King Sennacherib parted the waters of the Red Sea. The waters of the Nile. You go back through and you see all these parallel stories. You can see where all of the stories were copied from. In other words, we can see that later writers took these stories and they, paraphrased, they made cultural changes, but they took the same basic stories that you'll find in ancient Egyptian high culture, all the way down to Heru, born of the Virgin Isis. Jesus, born of the Virgin Mary. And you go through and you begin to examine this. And not only that, you see that these stories appear, these Savior God religions appear in about 16 locations around the world. And you can read about that in a book by Kersey Graves called The World's 16 Crucified Saviors, and also a book by Charles Vaux called The World's Saviors. And so when you study eschatology and examine and look at and recognize this history, and you trace it back into ancient Egypt, what you'll find is that the prototype, the foundation, that everything we see today is just simply a copy of something that was earlier, that was produced by black people on the African continent. And so even with the Quran, you take a look at, for example, the story of Dhul Qarnayn, and you look at this and you study it, and what you discover is that it's really a story about Alexander the Great that had been told and it was in existence before it was supposed to have been revealed to Muhammad ibn Abdullah in the cave. In addition to that, when you began to really closely examine it, the story of Mary and the palm tree, it's a pre-existing story that existed before Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born. We can go through and see the parallel constructions and see the sleepers in the cave, the elephant, you go through and see all of the major stories in the Quran, and it becomes very clear that it is a literary creation that is based upon earlier writings. It just simply copied earlier writings. And of course, everyone is entitled to believe whatever they want in terms of, the story that, it was revealed in a cave to a literate, man, and he was the prophet, and he, all of those things. We understand the nature of those things and rallying people and getting people to support and all that. But from a scientific and mathematical standpoint, from historical evidence standpoint, we can look at and see that Dr. Ben, what he did, he provides us robust evidence to show that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have their origin in ancient Egyptian religious systems. And so this becomes very critical to look at where we are today, because we find ourselves in a situation where we believe in things we don't really understand. We don't understand the historical context, and it's like a web of lies and deception to spin at us, and that actually creates the social stratum and social structure that exists today. And so the point is of 2030, Project 2030, is to, in essence, remove all of that, to remove the scales from our eyes, to take away the blindness, to take away the illusions and the delusions, so that we can see plainly where we are in time and space, and we can see plainly where we need to go from here. And so this is critical in terms of understanding the nature of the history. And so Project 2030 is about removing the scales from our eyes. It is a time of celebration of our African ancestors. It is a time to recognize the African Holocaust. And so when we go back and look at this if we look at this from a curriculum standpoint, we can look at this period of man developing on the African continent. We talk about a 523. We talk about the development of Nile Valley civilization. We can go through and talk about, for example, the Abydos ships. So back 3100 BC, at the very beginning of the so-called ancient Egyptian civilization, its first dynasty, what we find, they found a group of about 14 ships in a place near Abydos, and they called them the Abydos boats or ships. And people speculate about whether it was a museum type structure, whether it was a storage facility, but they found these 14 ships, and these ships actually were ships that really were large ships that had the capacity for seafaring. And when you began to examine the evidence of that period of time, which you'll find, not only did black people have the understanding to be able to use the stars to be able to identify your specific geographic location anywhere on the planet. In other words, they had the capacity to calculate locations, in essence, a GPS system. They also had something called the marine chronometer. So they had systems in place that would allow them to not get lost. In other words, they had the ability to travel anywhere on the earth and be able to return back to their origin based upon mathematics. And so this is the capacity that they had during this early period of time. And so now you find this group of ships. You also see a 140-something foot ship this buried at the base of the Khufu pyramid. So what we're talking about is a group of people that had seafaring capacity. They had the ability to travel all over the planet, all over the world. And so then enters in the work of Dr. Ivan van Sertima. And Dr. Ivan van Sertima, he wrote a number of books. He wrote something called The African Presence in Early Asia. He wrote The African Presence in Early Europe, The African Presence in Early Americas. He wrote established a journal called the Journal of African Civilizations. And one of the things he talked about was he looked at Jose Sereno's comments when he first discovered the so-called Olmec heads in Levanta in the Yucatan Peninsula, and how they were described as Ethiopian. And in addition to that, looked at their braids, their hair. There were a number of other factors that made it conclusive for them. But later people come and they try to debunk it, and then they came and recent people have come along and they say, oh, well, we found 2 skeletal remains from this period, and we examined them, and they don't have any African DNA. That they're more consistent with, or at least they don't have any modern African DNA, that they're more consistent with the Native American populations that exist today. And then, of course, if you examine that and you look at it and recognize that this is solely based upon mitochondrial DNA. So they say this to the public for public consumption, and people consume it, eat it up. No, they weren't black. They weren't black. But the fact of the matter is that they didn't do Y DNA, and they didn't examine evidence that could prove that these people were Africans or connected to Africans. Because the travelers, in terms of looking at those people that traveled in ships around the world, these were men. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this, to examine the Y DNA would have been the appropriate way to try to debunk and say that there was no black contact. But instead they did the MT DNA, which doesn't even have the capacity to scientifically show this. And so their intention was to obscure the facts with robust lies, in essence. And I don't know of any other way to put it. But the reality of it is that those who are looking at it with a scientific eye, who have done some research and understand the distinction between the Y and the mtDNA, and recognize that what the evidence of the study actually shows, that when we began to look at the evidences that were put forth by Van Sertima was an objective observer. He wasn't arguing his opinions. What he did was he just produced access to the objective evidence so that you can make your own decision. So he looks at it, he says, okay, look at the sightings of Balboa, then Balboa's writings. Look at the writings of Columbus, and Columbus saying that, that these black people came trading in gold-tipped spears, and they came from the southeast. So you look at that. You then look at the evidence surrounding the the omics. You then the iconography. In addition to that, he pointed out the linguistic research that had been done regarding the language of the people and its connection to the African continent. And he just simply put forward the facts and evidence. But then people tried to attack his character and tried to discredit him rather than try to discredit the facts that he put on the ground, because they didn't have a viable argument to discredit the facts that he put on the ground and put the evidence that he put into the record. So in terms of looking at this and, and understanding this, when you began to look at the evidence of these cultures, different cultures around the world, what you discover is that there are stories in all of these places. And if you take a look, for example, on the African continent, you go in sub-Saharan Black Africa, and there's stories about the Ancient of Days. And this character, this Ancient of Days, you find him in the book of Daniel in the Bible. This image of a black man with an afro sitting on the throne of God. And so in terms of this is part of the cultural artifacts that you see, and it arises in the cultures of the African continent, and the stories that are part of the African culture, multiple cultures within the sub-Saharan Black Africa. But when you go outside and look in the Americas and other parts of the world, you always see these stories that says that the gods arrived in ships, that the gods came in ships. And you also see stories that they left in ships. So what you see is a visitation by people from Africa. And you can see the evidence. You can look at the Abydos ships. You can look at the Khufu ship. You can look at the evidence of this. And then you go back and you see, for example, the Arab writers, Ibn al-Khaldun and al-Umari, they write about Bubakari, and how Bubakari in the 13th century is a Mali king. And he took a flotilla of 2,000 ships and plus 1,000 supply ships, and he traveled west and toward the Americas. And so this is a report, this documented in the writings of al-Umari in Ibn al-Khaldun. And so this was also something reported by Dr. Van Sertima. And so we then see the sightings of Balboa. And so in terms of looking at this and piecing the puzzle together, very clearly Africans circumnavigated the globe multiple times. And in addition to that, when you began to look at the features, even though you do not have the same level of technology that occurs in the Khufu pyramid, you can look around and see in the pyramids and monuments in the Americas, you see the use of the copper staple. It has no functional structural purpose. It's like a signature, that shows who did it, who the architects were. In addition to that, you see multiple other evidences: the use of geopolymer concrete, the use of pi, the use of the golden ratio and the golden rectangle, and certain mathematical principles, and the use of the meter as a unit of measure. And so all of these common elements indicate a single origin of a spread of high culture all around the world. And so not only do you see this develop all around the world, but you also see the spread of these religions around the world. And the oldest one goes back to ancient Egypt, the Assyrica and the Heru, born of the Virgin Isis. And so when you start looking at the unfolding of human civilization around the world, you see a distinctive period of the first and early migrations that were prehistoric migrations of black people when they first migrated around outside of Africa and began to people and populate the earth. And of course, you have melanated peoples that are the indigenous peoples all around the earth, and then of course you see those that get trapped in the ice ages, and you can see the mutations, and you see the morphological and physiological difference in the skin colors and all those things, and you can actually see a very clear scientific explanation of the unfolding of the peopling of the earth. And so when we look at all of this evidence combined, we then see there was a second migration. And this second migration out of the African continent was in essence a goodwill tour. It was a group of people that carried science and technology and engineering and mathematics and learning and spread it to other parts of the world, and actually seeded culture, seeded advanced learning and knowledge, and seeded civilization all around the world. And so when we begin to look at this evidence, the evidence begins to become very clear. It emerges as something that was purposeful. And then when we look at the third migration out of Africa, what we see is what we call the African Holocaust. And this is part of the focus of the Project 2030. But the other parts of it are structural foundation to be able to understand it in its proper context. And so what we can see is that around 652 CE, or AD, whatever way you want to try to define it, but around 652, the Arabs, after the formation of the religion of Islam, they actually formed the Rashidun Caliphate Empire, central governmental structure. And the Rashiduns then began to expand out of the Arabian Peninsula, and they expanded east and west. And they began to conquer territory in the name of Islam. And they established this Rashidun Caliphate. And they conquered Byzantine Egypt. And so this conquest of Byzantine Egypt resulted in, of course, you see the transitions to the Umayyads, and then you see the Abbasids, and if you understand that history, you can see that ultimately there's a breakup, and you have the Fatimas and the Mamelukes, and then of course the Ottomans restore a central caliphate, even though the footprint of Islam begins to expand around the world. When we began to look at this and understand the history of this, what we see is that in 652 there was an attack after the conquest of Byzantine Egypt. The Arabs turned their sights toward the south to Nubia, and they attacked the Dongola region of Sudan, of Nubia. And they attacked the kingdoms of Dongola, which was part of Makuria and Nubatia and Aloa. And as they began to attack in these regions, they weren't successful in terms of being able to take immediate control. It took them several hundred years. And then, of course, they attacked them from the east, came from the Red Sea and attacked later. And eventually they were overthrown and conquered. But during this particular period of time, this is when the trans-Sahara slave trade began. And it began under Arab Islamic rule. They began to take Africans, sub-Saharan black Africans, into slavery. And it was a distinctive slavery that was very different than any other forms of slavery that had been practiced in history. Because in the past, there had always been some form of slavery, whether it was debt bondage or other types of debt or whatever types of punishment for crimes or whatever. There's always some type of form of a slave system, but there was no racial-based chattel slave system. And this is what was distinctively created under the religion of Islam. And it was created and organized by an early convert to Islam, by a man known as Abul Kabar. And Kabar was supposed to be an expert in the so-called Israeliyat. And it's a so-called set of rabbinical writings. And we also have to recognize that it's distinguishable. It's not the Talmud. It is not the Jerusalem Talmud. It's not the Babylonian Talmud. And it is not part of other traditional writings that are part of the mainstream rabbinical traditions. This was something that was, these were Arabic writings, right? And so this so-called Israeliyat, this man was considered to be an expert in Israeliyat. There were others like Ibn Wahb, Munabib, and there were others who they advocated this ideal that black people were black because of a curse. And so they made up a whole series of mythology around this that in essence demoted black people from a human status to being a subhuman status. And this was part of Islamic culture, and this was promoted in Islam as a way of conquest of this proud and noble people that were from sub-Saharan Black Africa, who were the founders of the ancient Egyptian high culture, who built the foundation of human civilization and learning and knowledge. And this group of people were reduced to being less than human by force of violence, because the Arabs, what gave them the technological advantage was they had Arabian horses, and they also had something called the scimitar, which was a bent curved sword that gave them, it was a slashing sword, and it was a major technological innovation over straight swords. And when we began to look at also the camel became a very important instrument in terms of being able to cross the desert. And so when we look at this culture and look at some of the artifacts surrounding it, and we see Africans now being taken into race-based chattel slavery, and a whole doctrine of anti-black disinformation began to emerge and develop, and was used in the conquest of blacks and in the establishment of the trans-Sahara slave trade, in the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. And so we can go through and look at some details of that. We can see the architects of that. It's a very clear and distinctive history when we begin to actually examine the writings and look at the actual history. And then we can look at and see, for example, in 869 under the Abbasids, the Zanj rebellion took place under the Abbasids. And the Zanj rebellion in Basra, Iraq, about 500,000 black East Africans rebelled and fought for 20 years to establish their freedom from the Islamic Abbasid Empire, the Islamic Caliph. And of course, they were later, subjugated through force of violence. But the fact of the matter is that we can look very clearly, and you have people that argue, oh well, that Islam was really a black religion and all, but the evidence doesn't support that. And I understand the arguments, and I recognize the source of why some people would think that. But when we actually look at and examine the actual evidence, it just simply doesn't hold up. And so in terms of the ideal that somehow Islam changed and then YT people and Arabs took over Islam and all, or that the original Arabs were black or whatever. Yeah, the original Arabs were black, but that was at a date way, way before the religion of Islam came into being. It was way before any significant culture developed in the Arabian Peninsula, if you want to really look at it historically. And when you take a look at, you see the darker people in the south, in the area of Yemen and Oman and that region. But in terms of the people that became the founders of Islam, they came in from the north. They were the northerners. And yes, there was some mixture of people because there was the dam broke and there was other things. And so, yeah, I mean, you can look at all of that, but if you really examine it and look at the actual evidence, what you'll find is that it was people from the north, and then the Quran and the Hadith tradition and all of these things, and the northern Arabic version of the language was there, because people that spoke the southern Arabic, it was a totally distinctive language from the northern Arabic. You could take a person which spoke a northern Arabic language with a person who spoke a southern Arabic language, and they could not understand each other. The language was so distinctively different. And it's important to be able to examine this, and you can look at the works of people like Martin Delaney, who wrote a book called Origins of Races and Colors in 1879. He was a black man that actually went and secured land that black people could go through if they wanted to leave America, on the African continent, so that black people could be independent. In addition to doing that, he was a prolific scholar and wrote extensively. He was the highest ranking military figure, Major Martin Delaney, in the Civil War. And so when we began to examine this history and try to put it all together, we can go back and we can see that about 11 million black people were taken into slavery through the trans-Sahara slave trade, and about 9 million were taken into slavery through the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. And these slave trades in the Islamic world actually went on for over 800 years before the Europeans entered into the slave trade. And so, when we began to examine this and look at the facts on the ground, it's not giving Europeans a pass. It's important to be able to understand the context of it all. Because when you look at when Europeans came, Africa was already under siege. Africa had already been weakened and damaged severely. And when we began to look at this history and understand some of the details of the history, we go back and look at Kumbi Salah and see this so-called twin city capital of the ancient Ghana, not modern Ghana, but of ancient Ghana. And we see that there were twin cities. There was the city where the African king and the indigenous African people lived, and then there was a separate parallel capital city that consisted of Arab merchants and so-called scholars. And then there was a row of 6 miles of road in between of all types of stone buildings and structures and homes. And when we go back and study some of these ancient writings and look at and examine the evidence that has been found on the ground, a whole different type of picture emerges from what many of us have been told. And I think it's very significant to look at that Ahmed Baba. Ahmed Baba, he was the famous scholar of Timbuktu, the so-called chancellor of the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which was a significant Islamic learning center in West Africa. And this University of Sankore, Ahmed Baba was a Sanhaja Berber. His lineage came from North Africa, not from sub-Saharan Black Africa. So he wasn't a sub-Saharan Black African. But as a scholar, what he did was he spoke out because the so-called Ummah and the community, the Berber and Arab community was enslaving sub-Saharan Black Africans, even those who had accepted Islam as their religion. And Ahmed Baba spoke out and wrote and said, hey, look, Al-Maghali made certain promises to the Fulani and Hausa and the Tuareg, and he put forward the doctrine that was established there. And these people accepted Islam thinking they would be brought in as equals and all of that. But instead they were being enslaved, regardless of whether they accepted Islam or not. And they were being sold through the trans-Sahara slave trade. And so what happened is Ahmed Baba spoke out. And he was actually charged with sedition and imprisoned in Morocco in Arab Morocco for 12 years. And so, in terms of looking at this and understanding this history and seeing the fact that he spoke out, because, he spoke out based on his historical knowledge of the evidence and the promises that were made. And now black people were being enslaved purely on the basis of their racial classification. And he spoke out against this. And he was imprisoned for it. And this was the norm. This was part of the society that existed at the time and the power structure that was in place. And so when we began to fully examine this, and we can look at the fall of the Ghana Empire, the fall of the Mali Empire, the fall of the Songhai Empire, and see the dynamic and inner working, and then we see the rise of what they call Futa Jalan and Futa Toro and the Sokotos and all those kinds of things. We can begin to unravel the history of West Africa and then begin to see the role that Islam played in putting black people into slavery, because the major slave traders of black people were Muslims from the north, were Berbers and Arabs. And when we began to examine what actually happened, you can go back and you see, for example, the Catholic Church commissioned the Portuguese and issued a papal bull in 1555 that under Pope Nicholas that authorized the Portuguese to enslave sub-Saharan black Africans. And then you later see the iconography of the church change from black people to white people under Pope Julius II. And you look at all this period of time, but what something that becomes very significant and stands out is the fact that Queen Elizabeth entered into a treaty relationship with the Arab Sultan of Morocco and the Ottoman Caliph. And so when we began to for the Ottoman Empire, and when we began to look at this and understand this history, what we see is that England's entry into the slave trading system was actually liaison by the Arab Sultan of Morocco. And this was during a period of time of the wars of religion, European wars of religion. After the Protestant Reformation, there were 200 years of wars of religion in England before it fully developed the Church of England and became standalone. They rebelled against the Catholic world because the papacy only gave land and resources to the Portuguese and the Spanish in the Treaty of Tordesillas in about 1497. And so, in terms of being able to put the facts together and to be able to understand the elements of the history, what we see is that about 11 million black people were taken into slavery from sub-Saharan black Africa through the trans-Sahara slave trade, and about 9 million taken into slavery through the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade in the Islamic world. And they were taken to places like Venice and Cordoba. They were taken to Sicily. They were taken to Greece. They were taken to Cyprus. They were taken to Syria. They were taken to the Baltics. They were taken to Iraq. They were taken to Iran. They were taken to Afghanistan, and they were taken to Pakistan. They were taken to the Philippines. They were taken across Southeast Asia. They were taken to places like Bangladesh, and they were taken to Sri Lanka. They were taken to India. So black people were dispersed throughout the footprint of the Islamic world. And so, because they were taken there to work on plantations, to work digging mines, black women were taken in, brought into harems and used as various types of servants. And so when we look at this history and began to actually examine and understand this history, we have millions of black people dispersed throughout the so-called Islamic world. And you can see today, for example, there is in the Palestinian community, there's a group of Afro-Palestinians whose descent goes back to being slaves and being brought there as slaves. You see you see a black population in Sri Lanka who was brought there as slaves. You see about 13.5 million people in the southern part of Iran of African heritage that were brought there as slaves. Their ancestors were brought there as slaves. You see in Sicily, you see groups of black people that have been brought there as slaves, and you see some of their descendants today. And so when we began to look at and examine around the globe, you see these black communities all over Southern Asia, and you see these communities in the Baltics, and you see in Southern Europe, and around the Mediterranean. You see all of these populations that are the descendants of people that were taken into slavery in the Islamic world. Some 20 million black people were taken into slavery through the Islamic slave trades. And then you see about 12.5 million sub-Saharan black Africans taken into slavery through the transatlantic slave trade. And they were brought to North America and Central America and South America and the Caribbean. And we see these populations that developed, and we see the descendants, and we see today there is a population of about 112 million Afro-Brazilians. There's about 12 million Afro-Colombians. There are reported 2.5 million Afro-Mexicans, but deeper research shows that there are about 60 million people of African descent in Mexico. When you began to look at, for example, there are 13 CARICOM nations today that have more than a 90% black population of African heritage in the Caribbean as part of the CARICOM community. And these are the descendants of Africans. We can see in North America about 46.9 million people of African heritage in the Americas. When you began to look at the facts and began to examine the actual evidence, it just, all of this other nonsense that, people are bringing up, that saying, oh, you're a black Aboriginal Native American, or, or you're a Moor, or you're an Asiatic black, and you're this and that, and all these false identities, or you're a Hebrew, or you're this and that. None of these things stand up under any actual scientific scrutiny and evidence. It's all part of mythology. It's part of an identity crisis that the black community has gone through, and trying to self-identify and understand its origin and who it is. And what we're doing in this Project 2030 is putting forth the evidence to take a look at this and smash the paradigm. The paradigm of slavery, the paradigm of confusion, the paradigm of disinformation designed to make black people hate themselves, to stop black people from unifying, to stop black people from mutual progress. That we're smashing that paradigm with facts and truth and with information. And so we live in a new era of time where the old way of looking at things, we're moving into a new era of time where all things are made new. We have a fresh outlook on the world that's based upon the facts and information and the things that we were children about in the past that we didn't genuinely understand, that we understand now, that we have clarity on now, that we recognize that there was an African Holocaust. We recognize what happened to black people. We can see and very clearly understand who the perpetrators were. We understand the misinformation campaigns that were put forward, and we can specifically point to them. We can specifically show you the origins of them. You look at people like, for example, there was a Arnold Toynbee. He was on the cover of Time magazine as the Man of the Year in 1947. He was celebrated because he was a European scholar, British scholar, who wrote a 12-volume set called A Study of History. And in it, he said that he studied 21 civilizations around the world, and that of his research and study of these 21 civilizations, that the quote-unquote Negro did not contribute or did not make a creative contribution to any of these 21 civilizations around the world. And of course, it was a bold-faced lie, but it was a piece of propaganda that supported the white supremacy. It supported the ideal of Jim Crow segregation. It supported the ideal of colonialism. It supported the ideal of the subjugation of black people and the exploitation of black people. And to say that, well, black people, they're not quite as developed on the human scale as Europeans are. And it helped to support what they called the Aryan supremacy theory and the Teutonic origins theory and phrenology and some of the other pseudosciences that they developed in order to try to justify the atrocities committed against black people. But today, the evidence is all in, and the picture is very, very clear and is beyond dispute in terms of looking at and understanding the facts and understanding the history, that we are in a time of mental liberation. We're in a time where there is a new consciousness emerging. And it's important to be able to look at it and understand it and put it into context, because in reality, black people, we have actually built the foundation of the global economic system. We gave the foundation in terms of science and math and technology through our contributions in ancient Egypt and our spread of technology around the world. The gods came in ships. So when we go back and examine the contributions that black people have made, and we see the sacrifice that black people have made, because black people have been put into a situation where we were put into a system. And this system has produced the global infrastructure, and it has a distinctive purpose. And we can look at and see the so-called procession of the equinoxes and understand the great year and the eon, and understand the dimensions of time, and understand planning in terms of on a global scale. When we began to look at all of this and see black people at the foundation, and we see the so-called, the story about the Ancient of Days, say, for example, in the book of Daniel, where the Ancient of Days did sit. And then what happened is the Son of Man comes before him, and he's given a dominion in a kingdom. And so we're talking about a later time. During that time, it was a later time. But today, it's now. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this, what we're really talking about is this Son of Man, this man who has hair as a lamb's wool, feet as brass, as if burnt in an oven, which is a dark black and brownish color in terms of burnished brass. And when we look at this, it's the image of the sub-Saharan black African. And so when we began to examine these things and put all of this together and see what is the story that it's trying to tell us, what is it trying to tell us? And it's talking about a return where you have the kingdom of God coming. And it's like, well, what is this kingdom of God? What is this message about? And what is it literally trying to tell us? And when we began to examine and understand the nature of the metaphor, we can see today that Africa has a disproportionate share of the mineral resources of the earth. You have four of the five largest coltan mines in the world in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you can't have a cell phone and computers and certain technology without this coltan, the titanium that is extracted from the coltan. So when we began to look at the global economy today, you see at the center of it the African continent. And you see this scramble, this effort to try to subjugate Africans and take control of Africa's resources, and this fight to try to destroy the political power of the African continent. But black people are conscious and aware and are uniting. And there are 1.3 billion Africans, sub-Saharan black Africans. And there are about 700 million black people of African descent in the African diaspora around the world. And when you began to look at these populations, there's about 2 billion African people worldwide. And you began to look at what's going on right now. Not only are black people demanding reparations, but black people are now making very serious progress in communities all around the globe and on the African continent itself. Africans are uniting and building and developing high-speed rail systems to connect African cities. They're building major highway systems to connect the African continent. They have launched, 20 countries have launched satellites so that they have their own satellites that can provide for security monitoring, that can examine the crop situation and weather conditions and enable them to plan agriculture and do other major kinds of planning, as well as provide for security. In addition to that, you have Katanka Motors, you have Mobius Motors, you have Interson Motors, and you have Katanka, Interson, Mobius, and Kiera Motors. So you have some major auto manufacturing companies that are developing and producing electric automobiles and buses and other vehicles on the African continent. And so you see an emerging technological class of black people. In addition to that, you've got multiple stock markets emerging amongst blacks on the African continent. In the United States, you got a couple black people that have a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, but you don't have any black stock markets. There's talk and some effort to try to put together a black stock market, but not in the United States. It's not happening, not so far. But you see this now well underway on the African continent. You see people like Dangote building refineries, oil refineries, and building concrete plants and expanding the global black enterprise and building infrastructure and building a black middle class throughout the African continent. And so we see a major transformation taking place. And the greatest opportunities exist now with this emerging economy, this youngest population of the earth on the African continent. And we can see the connection between Black America and the African continent. And we look at the early 1900s when you see General Electric Corporation develop, and you see the American Telephone and Telegraph Company develop, and the Transcontinental Railroads, and you see the U.S. Steel Corporation and Sears, Roebuck and Company and Yellow Cab, and you see all kinds of major publicly traded businesses that flourished and developed to help produce a middle-class America. And you see these opportunities now happening on the African continent. So the greatest opportunities today are for black people in terms of the emergence of the African continent into a global economic power. And so this is what's happening. This is happening. And what's happening is it's reached a point where it can't be turned back. And all the kinds of efforts that people are trying to make to turn it back will never be successful, because it's part of a long-term plan that involves black people and did involve the sacrifice of black people. So some people, you got people that say, well, black people, you got kinky hair because you were cursed by God. You got black skin because you were cursed by God. And I tell you, when we examine the history, that's a bunch of nonsense. You're black because you were blessed to be evolved on the African continent. You have kinky hair because your hair evolved to trap moisture to keep your body cool so you survive in the subtropical regions of Africa. So it's not a curse, it's an adaptation. And it is a blessing because it's a sign that you are part of a blessed people who have gave gifts to humanity and that serve at the foundation of human civilization, that serve at the crossroads of the development of human civilization, and that sacrifice themselves to get us to the point where we are today. And now the return of this consciousness of who we are in our history is becoming manifest, and we return triumphant. And so in terms of understanding who we are and understanding how we fit into this whole thing, 2030, Project 2030, is the year of reckoning. It is the year of acknowledgement. It is the year of the recognition of the African Holocaust. Be blessed. Have a wonderful day. And I pray that you'll take this and work with it. Be blessed.